Hey, happy Friday. Welcome back to another Friday Tech Workshop. I'm Joseph, a senior developer advocate with Appsmith, and this week we're going to build an organizational chart using data from Airtable and the OrgChart JavaScript library. So org charts are useful visualizations for looking at the reporting structure of an organization and seeing how everyone's connected, but they can also be a hassle to keep updated, especially if you're using a design tool where you have to go in there and manually edit each data point. So today we're going to build a data-driven organizational chart that updates with the data. So we'll update a row in Airtable, changing what someone's position is or the name associated with that role, and the chart will update automatically. Now, the OrgChart library is pretty easy to use once your data is in the right format, but getting it there can be a little tricky. So today we're going to focus more on the JavaScript side and make sure you understand the code so that you can modify it to work with your column names. Let's get started by first checking out the finished app. We'll get a quick preview of what we're about to build, and then we'll jump into using the OrgChart library. All right, let's check it out. All right, so this is what we're going to build today. I've got an org chart here that is generated from the data that's in Airtable. And I'm using this corporate organizational chart template from Airtable. So they had a template that was already set up perfect for this. It has a column for the ID of each individual user, and then there's a column for their supervisor ID, or calls it reporting to in this one. And if you look at it in Airtable, it's going to show the person's name. But when you pull the data through the API, it is returning their ID, which actually works out well to help connect these. So we're going to write some JavaScript that loops over all of the employees, figuring out who they report to, and then creating this tree structure. And it's a JSON object with a bunch of nested employees. There's this children array that goes with each person that has anybody reporting to them. And then you put those employees inside that children array, and then this employee will have more inside there. So we have to build up that nested JSON structure where there's an employee and then some children, and then maybe one of these has children. So let's look at the org chart library first, and we'll see how it works outside of Appsmith. Then we'll get that working in a custom widget. And then the last piece will be to pull in data from Airtable and transform it into this format. So the examples are going to have data that's already in this format, but coming from Airtable, it's set up a little different, and we have to map over that data and restructure it before it will work with OrgChart. That's the tricky part. That's where we'll probably spend most of the time on this. So first, let's check out the OrgChart library. Now, this is an open source project found here on GitHub, and it is pretty easy to use. There's a bunch of examples here. Let's see, starting right here on the online demos. So I started with this one using using a local data source because I want to swap out the data. A lot of these other ones are hard coded. This one shows you how to import an object of data. And so these examples, they're live demos, and they don't have a lot of docs to go with each individual one. You just look at the source. So view the page source, and we can see that other than importing the libraries, we got to import a couple libraries here, and then you just have a function that defines a data source. And so here's the end of the data source. And outside of that, there's nothing to it other than selecting the div and saying .org chart and then giving it a config object. So it's really easy to use this library as far as applying a data set that's already in the right structure, but getting it there is tricky. That's where we're going to spend some time today with the JavaScript side. So first, what we can do is convert this example here. We'll set this up and get it working as a custom widget that's hard-coded with this same data. And then once that's working, we can swap it out with some data coming from Appsmith and work on all the JavaScript to transform it. So I'm going to follow along using a tutorial I've already written for this just to save a lot of typing so that we can come over here and copy some stuff. And if you want to do the same thing, there'll be a link in the description here. This tutorial has all the different code that we're going to be using. Also talks about how to create an Airtable data source and how to create your access token so that you can save that in Appsmith. We're going to skip past that because I've got several videos on it. And this shows how to do it right here in the tutorial. So you can go create an access token in the Airtable Builder Hub, give it at least read access for the base that you want to use, and then we'll set up a data source in Appsmith. And once you're pulling in that data, that's what we're going to build on top of. So again, we're going to skip past that because it's here in the tutorial. So what I'm going to do is start out with this API that's returning data from Airtable already. And I'm just going to make a new page and copy it to the page 2 here. So we got page 2, we'll go back to page 1 and copy that API to page 2. And then we'll just build on top of that. So skipping past the data source. And now here I've got a get employees query. There we go. We have some records coming back. All right, so we're going to start with building on top of this and set up our first custom widget with it hard-coded and then pass in this data, transform it. So let's go to the UI side. Going to drag in a new custom widget. All right, and then we'll go to edit source here. So this brings up a separate editor with the 3 tabs here for HTML, CSS, and JS. Just going to clear all this out. All right, and then if we take this first example that we got from their docs, if I just paste this in there, let's try that first. So we'll put this on the HTML side, and you can see $sign is not defined. So it is trying to use jQuery, but jQuery is not getting imported here because it is using a relative path, and in a custom widget, you have to import all of those. Every script, every CSS that you want to use, you have to put the full URL there to import it. So I have a slightly modified version of that where I've already swapped out the links. So we'll grab this, and it's basically the exact same example, just using links from JS Deliver to pull in those libraries. So we haven't changed any of the code yet, just their stock example. And you can see that it is kind of interactive. You can collapse some nodes here, but it is not working with pan or zoom yet. If we go back to their examples, so if you want to add pan or zoom, here it is. And so we'll just double check. Yeah, so this one is working for pan and zoom. And if you inspect it, sorry, not inspect, we want to view page source. Here it is. Okay, so this one's just slightly different. There's those extra 2 options here that are set to true. So it's really easy to use this library. You just got to get your data in this nested structure first. All right. Next, what we'll do, let's go back to our custom widget editor here. So this is working, although it's not set up properly for a custom widget. So the next thing we want to do, if we take everything inside this script tag, this function right here, so I'm going to cut this, and we'll put that in the JavaScript side, and then just back here and get rid of these empty script tags. Actually don't need the HTML part here either in a custom widget. I think we can leave out the head tags and just import the library. We don't really need the body either. So just to minimize this and only look at what actually matters here. So, all right, we're importing two scripts. I got jQuery and then OrgChart, and then OrgChart has its own CSS library. So not a lot going on here yet. You can see it is working. But I've got this warning that we're missing an Appsmith on ready function. So let's go back to the JavaScript side now. And what we really want to do is run all this code after Appsmith is loaded, after the app is open, after, most importantly, after that Airtable API has finished running. So if we wait for the Appsmith on ready function to call this, then we'll know that Airtable's done, that data's there. And if I try to pass in the Airtable data right now, this wouldn't work. You have to have that code inside onReady. So even though it's working for now, it won't work dynamically like that. So we'll put in an Appsmith onReady. This is a function that takes a function as its parameter. So I'll put an arrow function inside of here and then just paste this back in the middle. Now you can see it's working again, and that warning is gone. We're no longer getting the warning about missing an Appsmith on ready. All right, so it's coming along. Next thing, let's take this data source and I'm going to copy it. Let's go back to the main app editor here. And in the default model, this is where we can pass in some data from outside the custom widget from the rest of Appsmith. And so this is where we'll insert the data from the Airtable API. But first, I'm just going to hard code it, but get it moved out of the custom widget into the rest of the app. It's still hard coded with that same sample data set, but this is just a step closer in having that data passed in. So inside of here, I'm using the double curly braces or mustache syntax. I'm going to add an empty object and give it a property called data source, and then paste in that object. All right, so we should have, there's the other side of the data source, and then there's the full object. That looks right. Now what we're going to do is remove this data source, which breaks the custom widget for a second, and we'll reference appsmith.model.dataSource. Okay, so it's working again, and now look how little code that we have. Once you get rid of the data source itself, and that nested thing is, separate, it's just a couple libraries, one line of CSS, and then this little setup where you target a div and run OrgChart on it. So, I keep stressing it, but honestly, it's easy to use. It's just the trick is transforming your data. So we got really far pretty quick here, and now we're going to spend the rest of the time working on that JavaScript to build that nested structure. So back to the main app. And what we want to do is map over that Airtable data, this records array. So it comes back as an object with one property called records. And then in that array of records, there's an ID, a created time, and then fields. So all of the data that we want, all the user data is inside this fields object. And then you've got ID, created time, fields again, ID, created time, fields. So you can see this is not laid out properly to go into a table widget. To actually display this data in a table, we want the ID at the same level as those fields. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Let's start a new JS object. And I'm going to do two actually. We're going to use one for Airtable and one for OrgChart just to keep the logic separate. So I'm going to call this one Airtable Utils. And we will have a function to flatten the data. All right, and I'm going to assume that that query has already ran because it's set to run on page load. So I don't need to use an async function or actually tell it to run. We'll just say that const data equals, and then I've got that Airtable query. What is it called? Get employees? Yeah. Records. So there's the data, which is actually an object, and then Airtable wraps everything in that and has that records array. And let's just return that just to make sure that we're getting something here. So this is the exact same data that we're seeing over there on the query, but I want to reformat this in a way that flattens it, and we have ID and created time and then all of these fields without it being nested inside of that fields object. So what we're going to do is map over that data and take each row. Now we want to return an object, but that gets interpreted as the start and end of a function. So to return an object directly with a single line function, you can put parentheses around that. And now we can say return the ID using the row.id. I could put the created time in here too, but I'm going to leave it out. And then we just want the rest of the fields. So we can use the spread operator and say fields, row.fields actually. So let's see what that looks like. And now we're getting an array still of objects, but it's ID and then all of the fields. So it's flattened. And now I can put this in a table. So let's go back to the UI here. So this is our hard-coded one still. It's not doing anything yet. And up here, I just want to see our data in a table now that it's flattened. So we will connect this to the JavaScript here. I got my Airtable utils, flatten data, and I'm selecting the function instead of the dot data, which will trigger the function to run instead of grabbing whatever data was there from the last time it ran. So if we change the data, it'll rerun this function and the chart will stay updated. All right, let's see what next. We have the data flattened. I think the rest of this we need to start in the OrgChart utils. So there's some other stuff we can do with Airtable, formatting with matching up these IDs and things like that. We're not going to get into that on this one, but I do recommend separating your logic. And, if you've got one file for working with Airtable data and another one's building charts, I just think it's a little more reusable because you might do this next time with something besides Airtable. You could use this same technique and chart data from any one of our data sources, from Google Sheets or Postgres or HubSpot or anything you want to pull data from. So now we need to get this data from the output of the Airtable utils. We want to get that into the format of that nested JSON array. And again, I'm going to go back to the tutorial here to make this quick instead of a lot of typing. I've already got this laid out in the tutorial here. So that's where we're at. We've done that part. We added the onReady. And what we're trying to do is match this format for the OrgChart library, where we have one person, one object at the top, and then a children array with more people, and then possibly more children inside that node. And we have to build this dynamically from this flattened data set. So we just flattened the Airtable data set. Now we have the ID at the same level as all the other fields, which is more convenient for displaying in a table, but it is not the format that we need for OrgChart. So to get there, we're going to do two loops. We have to loop over the data once to figure out who's who and match everybody up in this config object. I'm calling it nodes here. And what this does is it sets the property of nodes dot employee ID to that employee. It puts the entire employee, including their ID, inside of an object where the key is their ID. This makes it to where you can go reference each employee and look them up by their ID without doing a loop each time. Okay, because we have to do two loops here. We have to do one loop to build this set of nodes, like a way to look up each user, and then a second loop, now that we know where everybody's at and what their ID is, a second loop to find their supervisor and add them to that correct children array. And you have to do the first loop all the way through to have everybody's ID mapped out before you start the second one. The alternative is a nested loop. You could look up and do like a find or a filter or for each or whatever inside of the first loop, but that would be terrible for performance. You would be doing like, for if you got 100 employees, you do 100 loops on the first one and then 100 more on the second. What we want is one time of each loop. So getting a little more into theory here. I don't want to make this too confusing or get off on a tangent, but basically this approach, it's better for performance. You just build up this object. So it starts with an empty object. And once that's built up, you can do the second loop and each one only runs once. So let's start out with a function to build the org chart. And I'm going to copy this. So we will have a function here called build org chart data, I think is what I called it. All right, so the first thing is just to set up this nodes object, and I need some employees here. So we're gonna pass in a variable called employees and set the default value to the data that's coming back from get employees that, oh, actually, we're not gonna use that version. We want the flattened Airtable flattened data. Okay, so we're passing in the flattened version of the employees and create a nodes object which starts out empty, loop over all of them, and let's just look at that much of it. So there's the end of the for each. And so if we return this, every uh, every employee has an object ID here, and then the employee itself, and a empty placeholder children array. So some of these will have children, but we're not worried about that yet. We're just putting a placeholder empty array there, so there's somewhere to push those values to in the second loop. So we have an object where ID, and then that person, and then ID and the next person. So that's the first step. Next loop, we want to go over the employees again and put everybody into the right child array. So back here, copy this, and a similar approach, only this time instead of starting with an empty object, we're going to start with an empty array. So I don't want to return this now. We start with an empty roots array, and you could have more than one person at the top level. If you're starting with just the CEO and going down, then you'll just have one root, but maybe you have multiple people at the top level. So in that case, you would want to put a company node at the top, because OrgChart expects there to be a single node at the top, or it just won't display right. It's expecting an object to come in with only one node and then children. So this has a little extra logic here to handle that, just in case you have more than one person at the top. It'll just use the first one, or the 0 index. So this loops over the employees again and finds the employee from the first node. Then their supervisor ID, it looks that up. If there is a supervisor ID, and that supervisor exists in that nodes object, then we want to push the children to it. Otherwise, this person is a root node. So if they don't have a supervisor ID, or if say they did have one but it wasn't in that list, then it'll just make them the root. So let's look at this value now, the roots. Let's see, find the other side of this for each here. And now we have an array, which is an object here. So we're not quite returning the final object that we need yet. This is pushing that value to the roots. And then the first object here, it's showing me, I think we just need to get roots 0 to make it the actual object. So we've got a person here, title, child array. Everybody's inside this one children array when you're looking at the CEO. Yeah, I made myself CEO. Let's click inside here. Why isn't that expanding? There it is. And then inside this one, now we're getting to where it branches out, So at the top level, there's only one children array, and now each one is branching out. So I think we're about there. The output of this one, let me name this. I think the output of this one is about the right format. Let's try swapping it out right here. So we already know that that this part of our data is connected, and we removed it from inside the custom widget. So it is pulling from out here. We know that. So we'll just reference that OrgChart utils dot, there it is, build chart data. Okay, now the chart didn't change. But if you look here, it did insert that data. So this is where it gets a little tricky, working with custom widgets. You can see the data is correct. It's got the new updated version coming from our function, but that is not what we see over here. I'm just going to refresh. And let me see if we need to run this again, just to get this stuff populated. Probably need to set some of these to run on page load or make a function to handle all of it, but here we go. Okay, so that did take the data from our function. It did actually generate a chart, and so that much of it's working, but it's not actually updating in real time. Like this chart won't render if I change something about the function and run it again, because we had to refresh the entire page. And you don't want that to, you don't want your users to have to do that every time. So let's head back to the custom widget editor. Okay, so we also need an Appsmith onReady function that can reinitialize this chart. This took me a minute to find, so let me find the code here and make sure we get it right. When you go to reinitialize the chart, um, it's just chart.init with data and then the data you want to give it, but you don't have to redo any options. So the first time around, we gave it data in the data source, and then and then the node content, you can give it a title. We also added pan and zoom when we were messing around with the first example. Um, but it looks like you only have to reapply the data to make it re-render, and it'll save all those other options. So I'm going to copy this on model change. Actually, I think I'll take the whole thing. But what's going on here is a slight difference. Instead of just running this without declaring it to a variable, I want to reuse this $ chart container here. I want to reuse it down here. And so the difference from what we have in the first one here is I'm declaring this to a variable outside of the onReady. So it's up here so that both of them have the right scope to access it. So let's just copy that. Still working. And now let's see what happens. Okay, so let's try it out now. You can see I'm still at the top here. I'm going to change my name. Let's put Appsmith here. And now if I rerun the API, I'm not going to refresh the entire page. We just want to see if that custom widget updates itself with new data here. And there it is. So that's the last piece is you actually get it working and it's reading your data when you pass it in, but then it doesn't update that next time around. So that's where we had to add that Appsmith on model change. And in most cases, I've found that you end up needing to reference something that was inside the onReady. So just pull that variable out, to declare it outside the onReady so that you can use it in both places. I think you can also maybe put this inside the onReady. So let's see what happens if I just declare that inside here. No errors. It is working on the first load. Let's see what happens if I change this back. And we'll just run the API one more time. Interesting. It cut off. Okay. Well, it worked, but it looks like we got a little UI glitch here. Maybe it's something to do with the zoom. There are a ton of other options here, speaking of zoom. So I only went over a few of these. But if you go back to the docs, you got some examples, a bunch of links to examples. Where is it? And here we go. All of the different options that you can adjust, and most of them are Boolean or a string, but you can pass in different parameters and create all types of interactions, node clicks if you want it to be expandable and collapsible, all that kind of stuff you can define here when you initialize the chart if you want it to be draggable. So there's a ton of other cool stuff you could do with this, but I think that's all I want to cover for this week. We went over how to build this custom widget, how to get the org chart library working in a custom widget, and then the tricky part of transforming your data and getting it into that nested JSON structure so that it will render an org chart. So this can save you a ton of time with keeping those things updated. It's way easier to just change a name or an ID in a table or an Airtable or database or spreadsheet, and then this will just update for you automatically. So you're not messing around trying to reposition and get everything aligned just right. Just make it data driven and be done with it. So I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions on this one or ideas for future workshops, feel free to drop a comment below. Thanks again for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you next week.